I'm not an expert in constitutional law or election law, but I am an expert in corporations. And so what I want to talk about is the more fundamental question of what is it that corporations are, what is it that they do, and what are the rights that in a perfect world we would want them to have so that they can do what we want them to do. So I want to start off with a legal reality that has been mentioned several times today and that Mitt Romney got completely wrong. You remember Mitt Romney said, corporations are people, my friend. No, Mitt, they're not. Corporations are legal persons, as the Supreme Court has reminded us in the Citizens United case. And that is different from being people or even an association of people. So one point I want to make is that I think one of the most dangerous traps that even experts often fall into is something I call the anthropomorphic fallacy. They want to think of corporations as somehow people or a group of people, as opposed to recognizing them for what they are, which is very powerful institutions that humans have indeed created, but that have motives and purposes that might be quite different from our human motives and purposes. And another word that you often see thrown about, a phrase that's used that I worry about because I think it's dangerously misleading, is to speak of corporations as legal fictions. There's nothing fictional about an Exxon or a General Motor. They are very powerful entities. All right. Nevertheless, I think it's fair to acknowledge that these legal persons only exist because we organic human beings decided to create them. As a species, we got dibs. We were here first, and I think we should embrace the idea that as the species that got here first, we should be fully comfortable with saying we are the ones who get to describe what rights and powers the legal persons should have, and legal persons should exist only and to the extent that they generate benefits for living, breathing human beings. And we tolerate these legal persons because they can and should benefit people, including future generations of people. And a consequence of that is that we should see exactly what we have seen in the law, the pattern that has been described by our previous speakers, which is that we give legal persons certain kinds of rights and we do not give them other kinds of rights, because there are certain kinds of rights legal persons have that allow them to work for the benefit of organic human beings, and there are other kinds of rights that we fear that if we gave legal persons those rights, they could actually use them to work against the interests of organic human beings. The best example I can think of is you really don't want to give a corporation the right to vote. Why? Because anyone who has $49 in their pocket can create a corporation. And we would very swiftly see that the number of votes cast by corporations could easily outnumber the number of votes cast by organic human beings. All right, so we need to take what I view as a functionalist approach to deciding what rights legal persons should have. And that raises the inevitable question, what is the functional right of legal persons? I specialize in corporations, including both nonprofit corporations and for-profit corporations. And if you were to distill the economic function of these entities down into its very essence, their primary function is to own assets that they accumulate and retain so that those assets can generate benefits to human beings over time. So why does the Nature Conservancy exist? It exists so it can own, in its own name, millions of acres of land that it can preserve and protect for the benefit of present and future generations. Why does General Motors exist? It exists so that it can own assets, auto manufacturing plants, that it can retain and protect so that over generations those auto manufacturing plants can generate benefits for human beings, including not only the people who buy the cars, but the people who work for the company and the taxpayers who receive the benefit of the income tax payments that General Motors makes on its corporate income. Once you understand corporations in particular, both profit and nonprofit, as legal institutions we've created to own assets over time, possibly in perpetuity, for the benefit of present and future generation of human beings, you realize that the rights they absolutely need to have are the rights to own property and to protect the property they own, and to enter contracts so that they can increase the value of that property, rearrange the uses of that property. All right, what about the First Amendment? Well, here is where we get to Bilotti. And I find that my own view is I agree, once you recognize that corporations are legal persons that own assets so that they can generate benefits for humans in the future, we also, I think, need to recognize that there is room for them to have First Amendment rights of speech. Why? Because if they do not have speech rights, their right to own property can very easily be threatened and their property can be expropriated. And we tend to forget in the United States what happens in legal regimes where property is easily expropriated, because it's not easily expropriated in the United States, but there are plenty of other nation states in the world where governments can easily expropriate private property. And the long-term consequence is that those states do not thrive, do not develop economically, do not generate a good life for their citizens. So what happens if we give corporations the right to own property but no right to speak? What happens is a rich individual like a Carl Icahn goes to Congress and spends tons of money trying to get public support for a proposal that says we should have fracking on all the lands owned by the Nature Conservancy. Yeah. What happens when corporations don't have speech rights? A corporation that runs a wind farm has to worry that the Koch brothers, who do work in oil extraction, will mount a massive public campaign that says, you know, these wind farms are killing wild birds. We need to shut those wind farms down. So there has to be room, I think, for corporations to have speech rights. But that doesn't mean their First Amendment rights should be coextensive with the rights of organic human beings. There's another First Amendment right, the right to privacy, that I would suggest is not functionally necessary for most of our for-profit and nonprofit corporations to do the job we want them to do to generate benefits for human beings. And in fact, we actually have a very good model of how you can drive corporations to produce better results for human beings by requiring them to make extensive disclosures, and that is the model of the publicly held corporation that since 1933 and 1934, under the Securities Act of 1933 and the Securities Act of 1934, have had to make extensive disclosures of, among other things, their political involvement. So I actually looked, if you look at the firms and the individuals that are generating most of the money that leads to the kind of corruption that Larry Lessig was describing this morning, you will find that it's not necessarily public corporations that are the biggest part of the problem. It is the private companies, the Cook Industries, Sheldon Adelson's gambling business. Those are private companies not subject to disclosure requirements. It is not Goldman Sachs that's making large contributions. It's the PACs that are created by the wealthy individuals who are the employees and the managers of Goldman Sachs. It is not the legal entities that are publicly held and subject to the disclosure requirements that are the source of the greatest problem. In fact, I suggest that if you can talk to them in a way that they can hear, again to quote Larry Lessig, you might even find a few allies among those publicly held corporations. So let me close by just sharing with you a complaint that I have often heard from corporate CEOs and directors. They are very concerned about the corruption problem, and they actually don't see themselves as the perpetrators. They often see themselves as the victims. And what they say is, we have to worry because every election season, we have politicians knocking on our doors and saying, you know, you ought to donate money to my campaign, because if you don't, then this legislation proposing to regulate your industry is likely to go through. And so I think that although there are certainly corporations and even some publicly held corporations that would have CEOs and boards that would cling desperately to the notion that they need to be able to give unlimited amounts to political campaigns and on issue advertising, you might find at least a decent minority of business people with whom you could find a coalition that would support the sort of legislative changes that I was so happy to hear Larry Lessig describing this morning as a means of getting money out of politics. Because public corporations at least don't actually want to give away money to anyone. All right, so thank you.